Let me just do the usual housekeeping before I introduce people a bit, which is to say, first of all, thank you ever so much to our wonderful panel of speakers. We've got everybody here except Rachel from Cardiff. Hopefully she'll be joining us soon. I am Martin Parker. I'm going to be chairing the session, assuming my internet holds up. This is an opportunity to talk about both the specific case of Leicester Business School and what's been going on there, and we've got some people talking about that, but I think also a more general conversation about the kind of principles that are at stake here in terms of ideas about critical thinking, academic freedom, the neoliberal university, and so on. Because this is a Zoom conference and because we've got so many people on, over 200 people on now, I'll be taking questions from the chat. We don't have an opportunity for people to ask questions directly, but I'll take questions from the chat and then feed them to the speakers or to any of the panelists at any particular time. Is there anything else I need to say about the organisation of the conference? Probably not. Might as well just crack in and do it then. So, hello everybody, and thanks ever so much for turning up. Just a warning, we are recording this, and the recording, hopefully, if all the panelists are happy with that, will be made available at some point in the future. It's also possible that some excerpts from this might be published in the Future of Work blog, which two of my colleagues at Bristol, well, it's three colleagues at Bristol actually sort out. The general conversation here, I think, is certainly prompted by Leicester, but not restricted to it. I should start off by saying, by declaring an interest here. I worked at Leicester on and off for about 14 years, I think, in two phases. And when I heard that my friends and colleagues were under the kind of threats that they have been over the last couple of months, I was both guilty that I wasn't there with them and also bloody relieved that I wasn't there. And so in some sense, I guess this is partly a reaction to that, a gesture of solidarity, but also hopefully a way of trying to think through some of the problems that don't just beset Leicester, but other places too. So let's kick off, enough waffling on from me. Let's kick off with Simon and Gareth, both of whom work at Leicester University. Simon was head of school for a long time. Gareth, a colleague there who I've known for many years as well. So Simon, I think you're gonna start.
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and thanks to all of you for attending, and indeed to the rest of the panel for sharing the platform. We've decided to split it. That I'll give you a bit of potted history, given I've had longer in the zone of doom than Gareth. I first joined the school. Well, it was then the Management Centre at Leicester in 2003, I believe. So if we go a bit further back, Leicester has had some sort of provision in business and economics for about 100 years. Department of Commerce was, I think, its original instantiation. That morphed into a Department of Economics. And then sometime in about the late 80s, 90s, an entrepreneurial unit split off from economics under the guidance of Peter Jackson, a fine academic who started selling distance learning programs, primarily master's programs, and did so with huge success and made huge oodles of money for the university. The university kept trying to hire more staff to kind of build up the academic credentials and kind of critical mass behind that, but it kind of kept hitting the same stumbling block. It was kind of seen as a teaching factory, and nobody wants to join a teaching factory. So in the end, they hit upon the grand scheme of making a big splash and getting a load of people in at once. And Martin and I were in that first flow, and that was under the leadership of the eminent and lovely Gibson Burrell, whom I'm sure a number of you have been reading the fine rhetoric of in recent weeks. The man can turn a phrase. From that point, we were pretty upfront about the fact that we were going to run a school of management, as it became, around being not only interested in providing managers with tools of their trade and some capacity to think about their practice, but also to reflect upon management as a occupational category, as a sociological category, as an economic category. And we kind of thought that one of the best ways in which management gets better and causes less harm and does more good is if you subject it to critique. We were very upfront about that. And we made that very clear when we recruited students, and it worked very well. Gibson was in charge when the school was first submitting to the National Student Survey in the UK, and it came out first and second, I think, in the first 2 years it was in play. Following Gibson's reign, Alan Bryman held the fort for a while, the sadly departed Alan Bryman, who we all miss. And then I took up the reins in about the end of 2009 and served 6 years, just one less than for the minimum term for murder, I believe. During that period, we peaked, I think, at number 2 in the Guardian league tables for subject matter. I think the lowest I ever took us was 12th. Since 2016, when the school changed direction and was forcibly merged with the Department of Economics, and when I say forcibly, neither party was happy about this marriage, but someone on high thought it was a very good idea. Since then, about somewhere between 50 and 70 of staff have left of their own volition, and actually it must be more than that. I think that was before more recent times. It was about one a week for a while, and Joe was indeed an escapee during that period. And since then, we have been crashing and burning in all sorts of external measures. I believe we're currently at 110th out of 123 providers in the business and management area, according to The Guardian. And the powers that be have decided that the wisest way to make sure we can hit that bottom spot really quickly is to disinvest from the areas for which the school, or particularly the management side of the school, is particularly well known and in which it was particularly successful. And it does seem as well that what we're being told very clearly that it's not the quality of what we do that's an issue, it's the nature of what we do that is no longer required at the University of Leicester. We're told that this is a strategic set of decisions. It's hitting across the university. There are 145 people at risk, or were 145 people at risk of redundancy, with the intended aim of that being 60 bodies actually exiting the building. And by that I mean full-time equivalent bodies. So in a few cases, there'll be some Frankenstein reassembling of 0.2s and 0.4s in order to make whole people that can lumber their way down the university road on the way to the train station. And there are 16 of us, or there were 16 of us in the school. As a result of some pushback in consultation and the more ludicrous suggestions being retreated from, I think we're now down to 13 of us at risk. And there seems to be no sign whatsoever that we will not be at risk. And there is every intent to push us out the door as quickly and as rapidly as possible. We have, what else can I tell you as part of the background? Despite this being not financial and apparently strategic, the university doesn't have a published strategy. Apparently that's been delayed by the vicissitudes of the pandemic. But the vicissitudes of the pandemic don't seem to have stopped senior managers writing 8 cases for redundancy that are apparently derived from the strategic plan that nobody's allowed to see because it's so strategic. It's got a nice shiny ginger tail, much like my colleague's beard there, if you're looking for a visual representation of what a cunning tail looks like. In terms of where the university actually might be, well, there are some dodgy things afoot. In 2016, it had long-term debt of about 76 million, quite reasonable for the sort of turnover it has, and the sort of thing you need to replenish buildings, keep up the estate. It was in breach of its covenants on some of its lending at that point, and the senior managers decided that what would be a smart move would be not to take a short holiday they had from those breaches being applied to allow for restructuring, but instead to borrow more and borrow heavily. So they borrowed another 55 million via private placements from 2 American insurers, and they used 16 million of that to throw into an escrow account, and then entered into a long journey in a special purpose vehicle. That special purpose vehicle is a limited liability partnership, which is building the latest halls of residence at the Freeman's Common site and some lecture theatres and some car parking. And that's incurred another indirect set of debts of about 145 million over 45 years. We don't know the details because they're all private placements with private equity, but we do know that there's 45 years of index-linked bonds being paid out of the receipts from that development. We know that the university only holds 10% of the equity in that development, and we're pretty certain that the university is on the hook for various facilities management contracts, including things like, I imagine, guaranteeing the number of funds on that the students will be providing. So we could be arriving in the autumn with the university holding an asset that it only has 10% of, but with liability for the income flows in and out to a set of bondholders. Since then, the university has been one of only 3 in the UK to draw down emergency funding from the government, the other 2 being London Business School and the LSE. London Business School has paid theirs back already, LSE hasn't. LSE is in a bit of a rocky state as well, I think. We took down 60 million, it's very short term, and my best guess is, given I can't see any of the details because it's all hidden, and there's no governance structures functioning in the university anymore that actually hold anybody to account, my best guess is that's how they've got off the free. We are again in breach with who wouldn't accept whatever proposals were put to them about how to take them out of breach. That do you, Gareth?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Yeah, so I won't try and kind of construct a chronological narrative of what's been happening at Leicester, largely because it's such a kind of, it's such a wash with lies, contradictions, obfuscations, kind of backpedaling and retroactive explanations that to do so would require a kind of 45-minute monologue, which I'm not going to subject you to, nor would Martin and Pete allow me to, I suspect, quite rightly. But I'll try and kind of go through a couple of kind of key points in it and talk about some of the things that we have been doing in response to it in Leicester and outside Leicester. Before I do that, just to kind of add to what Simon was saying about the financial situation at Leicester, I mean, I think what is very clear to us is that there is a financial motivation for the redundancies. But it's worth pointing out that if the university admits that there is a financial motivation, then they have to hand over all sorts of financial documentation to us as part of the consultation process to allow us to build counter proposals. So they clearly do not want us to see that information, and therefore it is very important to them to say this is not a financial case. We've had a similar situation with data from external consultancies as well. When we were involved in what was called the pre-change engagement session before the redundancies were announced, lots of the arguments being made in those sessions seemed to come in particular from work done by Data HE. We asked for this information at the time through Freedom of Information requests and were told that commercial sensitivities meant that we couldn't get it. Now that again changes when you're in a redundancy situation. Now we do have a right to that information, and that right overrides any commercial sensitivity issues. However, we are being told now that although that external consultancy data underlay the pre-change consultation, it has nothing to do with the cases for change that are currently through which the redundancy threat are currently being expressed. So clearly, as with the financial data, this is another thing that it is very, very important to the university that we do not get hold of and do not see. So in terms of what's been happening at Leicester, again, I'm not going to go into all of the details. I noticed actually in the chat that mine and Simon's colleague Oz, I think, posted a link to a website where we've explained a lot of what's been happening and put various resources and other things on. So if you scroll up, you should be able to find that. But to cut a very long story short, 16 of us were told in January that we were at risk of redundancy and invited to a first collective consultation 1 week later. Now, when we first got those invitations, we were not told what the kind of case for change was, what was being disinvested from or closed or anything like this. So we had this week where we figured out who was in scope, and we were trying to figure out what the commonality was between those people. What is it about the work that those 16 people do that situates us in a group together, but separately from any one of our colleagues around us in the same department? And we were largely at a loss to explain that. I mean, this is a group that included you know, people with very, very long, illustrious kind of careers, Gibson Burrell, Valerie Fournier, for example, and also early career researchers, one of which is me. It include mostly people doing critical work, but from a variety of perspectives, and in fact, not all people doing critical work. One thing that really did stand out at that time is of the 16 included 8 union officers and reps. So that was one thing that situated that group as being a group that was distinct from most of our colleagues in the wider school. So that obviously rings some alarm bells, I think. So we kind of get to this sort of consultation stage. We hear the case for change. The case for change is, as Simon elaborated, around a disinvestment from CMS and political economy. We ask a series of questions around this. I mean, this is the scoping exercise, the decision around who are at risk of redundancy and who's not is one that's been done by the Dean and Deputy Dean of School, supposedly alone. These are 2 professors, a professor of marketing, a professor of economics, both relatively conservative in their approaches, not people familiar with the fields from which they're proposing to disinvest. And we wanted to know how they, how they'd done this, how had they defined critical management studies and political economy, how had they decided who should be in scope and who shouldn't be in scope, given that, as far as we could tell, probably around 50 of our colleagues were also, in some sense, political economists or critical management scholars. It's a very large proportion of a very large school. So we eventually do get some definitions. We think probably this is the first of a long line of retrofitted explanations that they came up with later, but we did get some definitions that they supposedly used, one of which is a kind of legitimate but nevertheless contested description of critical management studies. The other, related to political economy, is on the one hand, a description of how political economy is used within critical management studies, and also, in addition to that, a description of the Centre for Philosophy and Political Economy, which serves much more easily as a description of philosophy than it does of political economy, with the oh so convenient kind of addendum, which I'll just want to read out to make sure I get it verbatim. The oh so convenient addition to that: in defining political economy for this case, we exclude the orthodox rational choice tradition as being a separate aspect of PE. So a retrofitted explanation designed, we think, to kind of course correct when it seemed clear that actually this was not the right group of people to fit the descriptions as given. So the rest of the details of the case I won't bother going into, because there are too many of them. There are lots of kind of open mouth and disbelief moments that you can read about on our website. It is worth saying, though, I think, or speculating a bit on what the actual kind of strategic aims of the university probably are here, and what the consequences of those might be. And I think it's probably 2 things going on at once. One is straightforward union busting. In that sense, it could have been any other department in the university in which there was a concentration of officers. It just so happens that within the University of Leicester, there is a concentration of officers and reps within the management and organisation division of the School of Business. So making a redundancy case there allows the removal of vast swathes of active union members all in one go. Now, we figured out that across the university, there is for a randomly selected member of staff, there is a 1 in 27 chance of having been threatened with redundancy in this current round. If you are on the Leicester UCU branch committee, there is a 1 in 4 chance of having been threatened with redundancy as part of this current round. So that's mostly concentrated in our department, but there are others dotted around elsewhere as well. So we suspect, of course, that this is not just kind of retribution or revenge. We think probably what this is that there are further rounds of mass redundancies coming a year away, a little further down the line. And the intention is to hobble the union in the first round to make it harder to fight the subsequent rounds. So alongside that, this is obviously an attack on critical thought, and we'll hopefully have the opportunity to talk that out together a bit more as this day goes on. But for me, I mean, I see this as kind of part and parcel of, you know, for example, the Conservative Party's attacks on academic freedom, press freedom, the right to protest and assembly, etc. I think it's part of one move, all happening at once, and that's of the sort of consequences of this course of action that I really want to pick up on. Obviously, there are lots of consequences for us as individuals and for the school and for the University of Leicester. But the key one that we're particularly worried about, and the thing that we are particularly keen to fight, is this issue of academic freedom. And we believe what's happening in our department at Leicester at the moment is an attempt to set a precedent around what can be done around academic freedom and redundancy. So just to be clear, in common with all of our colleagues in the school, we are not contracted to do research in critical management studies or political economy. Research is self-directed, self-chosen. In common with all of our colleagues, we're not part of any divisions or departments or groups that compel research within those areas. And in common with all of our colleagues, no groups, divisions, departments that we are part of are threatened with closure. So we've thus far not been able to find any other examples of situations where a redundancy argument has been attempted through an analysis of the approach taken in research content. Completely unassociated with any sort of departmental closure or anything along those lines. So the implication of that is, sure, there are 16 of us, but if a legitimate redundancy argument can be made simply by describing a research area in as much detail as you want, with as much specificity as you want, then any member of staff in any UK university can be got rid of. If they, academic staff can be got rid of if they're seen as a problem, simply through a description of their research and the statement that this is now an area for disinvestment. So we think it's very, very, very dangerous. So just quickly then, what about what's been happening in Leicester in response to it? And that's kind of really that's sort of happier story. The level of organisation around this has been fantastic. Actually, it's been one of the best things I've been involved with. The highlight of my career, right at the end of it, you might say. But we've been organising within UCU and also outside UCU. We've been organising within the University of Leicester, but also many people who were never members of the University of Leicester or who were at one point and are no longer have also been doing a lot of solidarity work with us. So on the kind of union front, today is the day that our ballot for industrial action goes live. Our consultative ballot that we ran previously gives us good reason to feel very confident about the way that that's going to go. So that started today. That's obviously not just about the School of Business, that's across the university. Both UCU and the Students' Union have taken votes of no confidence in the Vice-Chancellor, both by landslides. Our own department has taken a vote of no confidence in the Dean of School, which was again very heavily in favour of no confidence. And then outside the school, we've got, also outside the university entirely, we've had innumerable different editorial boards writing open letters, writing letters of concern to the Vice Chancellor. And one thing to kind of bear in mind is specific journals have been named as reasons for people to be made redundant if they published within them. So organisation, culture and organisation, ephemera, I forget which others, but there's a whole series of journals have been kind of fingered, as it were. So in addition to that, what else have we had? We've had this open letter with more than, I think, getting close to 3,000 signatories, people active in the field internationally. Former students have written an open letter. We've had resignations from external examiners. What else, Simon? Can you think of anything else that we ought to add to this this list?
Plenty of stuff from journal editors. We've had the British Academy of Management. We've had members of the British Academy, orchestrated, I believe, by one person whose fine work I can see appearing in the chat. We've had, what else have we had? We've had people handing back their honorary degrees in relation to other departments. Yeah. And today, in fact, ITV News decided to start bothering us and paying some attention to this. Yeah, so I think at the moment we've had, Critical Perspectives on Accounting was one of the journals. Apparently that one's definitely not a good place to publish, and we should know that because it says critical in the title. So we really are being very, very silly to go there in the first place. But unfortunately, nobody told us in advance that we shouldn't be going there, which I think is kind of a little unfair.
Yeah. Simon and Gareth, can I just ask one question before we go over to Joe? Because one of the, and part of this comes out of my context at Leicester too, that during the time I was there, we were continually being told that having a critical school was financially damaging. In other words, if we did do simple, kind of vanilla business education, that would be more profitable. What's your response to that kind of stuff?
Well, during the period when I was running the school, I think I'm not giving too much away in terms of specific numbers, but let's say we turned over about £20 million a year. About 10 million of that went on our local costs. About 5 million went on paying for central overheads, and 5 million were distributed across other people's walls, I believe. So it didn't strike me as an unprofitable operation, and I'm sure Rachel and others might be able to comment on this. I don't think it was a bad level of contribution at any point in relation to other universities conducting similar work under similar circumstances. And to be fair, we were quite happy with that. Yeah, a university is a university. If a funding model is such that some areas need to cross-subsidise others in order to create a wholeness of provision, that's fair enough. But there's some curious fantasy that this can be milked and milked and milked and milked. And I think at a certain point, it won't give any more. And I guess the other aspect of the question you're asking is, I've never seen any evidence from any manager or prospective manager who's likely to have anything approaching a successful career that thinks that critique is not a useful part of their intellectual armoury. Quite the reverse. Quite the reverse.
Thank you, Simon. Let's pass over to, so thanks to Simon and Gareth. That was really clear, really helpful. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, but we've got some time for that afterwards. But now I guess we're kind of pulling back a bit to the sort of national position. So, my huge pleasure to introduce Joe Grady, who's the General Secretary of our trade union, the UCU. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Martin, and hello, everyone. Before I do say anything nationally, I do think it's important to just say a few things because I used to work at Leicester. I got my first academic gig at Leicester back in 2009. And I think if you want just sort of one anecdote of the many, many, many that anyone who spent time at Leicester could tell about how it changed as an institution from that period to now is you will all be familiar with university crests and symbols, and Leicester paid an extortionate amount of money to get all of their branding rebranded. And one of the things that happened in that was the little shield, the little crest of the university used to be a book, and it used to be an open book, and it had some text on it. And I don't speak Latin, but the text in Latin said, "Through us they live." And it was about how the university was purchased and built on the money of the people of Leicester as a living memorial to people who died in wars. Now, the rebranding exercise of the university removed all the text from that open book. So we have books with no words, and the crest itself ended up looking like something like Lancaster University. And I think that's quite important because I'm not seeking to kind of make any excuses or allowances for the university, but I think it has lost its way in many ways, doesn't know what it wants to be, and has leapt from crisis to crisis that has involved making staff the shock absorbers of those crises through seeking to cut costs and control people, as opposed to actually listening to what had made the university function and be successful in the first place. And when I arrived in 2009, I think I was the 33rd member of staff. I was recruited by Alan Bryman, but by the time I arrived, Simon was head. And it's fair to say it was a very CMS, very critical management studies heavy department. But during my time there, and I've definitely seen Stephen Dunn in the call, I don't know if Kenneth Weir is, I actually embraced CMS quite a little bit. And I think one of the papers that we came out of the spirit of what was at Leicester was a reading group on Piketty, which is in my office somewhere. It's a bloody great big book. There's no way I would have read it without a reading group. And by the end of it, we actually had a really productive conversation, the three of us, about how CMS had a lot to learn from international labour process or labour process studies, the kind of stuff that I used to do. And one of the sort of final things I did before I left Leicester and went to Sheffield was actually looking at how all the different disciplines that had ended up grew up. I think by the time I left Leicester, there was at least over 100 academic faculty, how everybody had kind of grown together in their understanding of what critical management studies could lend to other disciplines, and how we could actually organise and not just tell people about how organisation should be or could be, which I think has been part of CMS, but actually imagine it. And I think one of the reasons why, yes, this is an attack on academic freedom, and I think Gareth and Simon outlined that brilliantly, but it is an attack on workers. And it's an attack on workers who very effectively in the School of Business, and I'm going to say a bit about this for a moment, built industrial power. So one of the things that happened during my time there was we had, I think, I might be misquoting this, but I'm almost certain it was 90, if not 95% UCU density in academic staff in the School of Business or Management, whatever it was called at the time. That is staggering. We do not see those levels of union density in the UK anywhere in any sector, let alone in academia. And there was many things during my kind of final years in the school, which was 2015, 2016, that we pushed back on, which because the management school was the biggest school in the university, so they tried a horrific workload model, tried to ram it through because they thought we had a friendly manager at the time, but they miscalculated that one as well. And we fundamentally, as a group of workers, went into organisation overdrive. We would send really aggressive, hostile messages about management over the reply all list. We openly organised, we held meetings for people who weren't in our union, and it's clear they didn't like it. But they also, I think, miscalculated because they did think it was just the School of Management, and it wasn't actually. It was something that admittedly was spearheaded from the school, where I think all these different theories about organising were translated into practice, undoubtedly. But because in 2016, there was also a redundancy programme that the university was attempting across the institution, those principles of organising, of talking to people, of reaching out to people who don't agree with you, much like this meeting is doing, you know, reaching out to people at different institutions who maybe aren't in the union, it really worried the university. And I think that year there was a boycott of graduation ceremonies, and they assumed that it was going to be management students that would cause the most disruption. So they picked, I think, the graduation ceremony that had geography in it, and they kicked off as well. So they were just all the time misunderstanding their own academic community, misunderstanding their own students. Obviously, this culminated in a student occupation of Leicester's equivalent of University House, the building that has the Vice Chancellor in it, completely student-led, autonomous. And I think it's fair to say that this utterly freaked them out. It led to Paul Boyle eventually leaving. It led to another successful ballot from the Leicester UCU branch over redundancies targeted at professional service staff. So I agree, but I just want to kind of give that extra context, because I worry that you are doing yourselves down, actually, that this is all the things that you said academically, and I know other people in this call will have points of view on that. But this really was them understanding that as workers, you had built substantial industrial power, and they are not used to having their own managerial power checked. You know, they naturally are given it through their position in the employment relationship. And what you did beginning in the School of Management, but trickling out across the branch, was to create really effective counterbalance mechanisms on that. And one of the reasons, and obviously I've heard them firsthand from some of you over the past few weeks, they've been coming at you so personally and draconianly, is because they want to scare you. And I think it's really powerful that so many people are on this call, because you are correct. This is, obviously it's egregious. Is it an example of what we're seeing across the sector? Yes. But is it also something else and worse? Yes, undoubtedly, because you know, I think in some ways critical management studies is a really interesting example of offering forward perhaps a new vision of higher education. You know, it challenges metrics, it challenges this idea that we should be beholden to financial markets, it challenges to have imagination. And I think when combined with some of the other kind of academics and activists that grew up at Leicester during that time, it started lighting a lot of fires. So everybody that's been doing everything they can on this call already in the months that we've been through, you're going to need to keep doing it more and more and more as we pass through this ballot period. Everyone at Leicester is going to keep needing shots of adrenaline from you, because it's really hard to keep on organising like you are, but you are generating an incredible amount of your own attention, and we haven't even got into the ballot yet. So I think I just wanted to give that extra context, really, because we are seeing attacks across the sector. If we look up to Heriot Watt, which I think might be a good example for Leicester to think about, you know, very similar not the same, but, you know, the similar kind of financial arguments. We have to do this, you don't understand. They got through their ballot, and it was an academic boycott that in the end really shook up their university's senior management team. It's kind of, I think, counterintuitive to us as academics to want to go for ultimate reputational damage. But I mean, they're wrecking it themselves, and we all know that. And there's been obviously an exodus of staff from Leicester. So I'm going to wrap up, Martin, because I know there's other people to speak, but I just wanted to finish with saying, I think what is happening here is really important, not just for workers, but actually for the academic discipline of CMS to keep on living and growing and progressing, because I think sometimes amongst us as academics, there's a tendency to want to find a clever theory, or there's a tendency to want to win the argument, or, you know, to find a legal solution. And all of those things have a place, and sometimes they can be effective, but there is no substitute for the day-to-day grind of organising and bringing people together and having conversations that has been happening. Because ultimately, if clever arguments and facts and data won, we wouldn't have just spent the last year in lockdown. We'd be out doing what New Zealand are doing. Like, we have to ram this through. And I have complete faith in people at Leicester. This is the third time you've been made to do this in, you know, 5 years. So I just wanted to kind of end on that, really, that it's a perfect culmination, but also an example of what, as an academic discipline, we all need to keep doing.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Jo. A really inspiring message for the people at Leicester as well, I think. Can I just ask, just while we wait for questions to come in, just to kind of go back to that question, which I think many staff might be thinking, you know, that it is dangerous for them to damage the reputation of their institutions, because students won't turn up, they'll go elsewhere, etc., etc. So maybe, you know, it's better to keep quiet because you're going to do yourself damage in the long term. You just explore that a bit for the audience.
Two things to say. One, if you look across the sector, I can't speak specifically about Leicester, but I suspect it's following the sector example. Numbers are not down. Even with Brexit, even with COVID, we have record numbers of people wanting to study in UK higher education institutions right now. So I wouldn't basically forfeit the idea that you protect yourselves industrially in your workplace on the basis that we might not get students, because I think if you internalize that, then actually you're always on the back foot and willing to absorb whatever bullying practices your manager throws at you, on the hope that you might just be able to keep an enclave of an organisation that's inherently abusive. So I think that's quite important. But also, we know that money is just squandered. I mean, I could pull out endless examples from when I was at Leicester, but across the sector. One of the talks the Vice-Chancellor once gave, he even had behind him, this is Paul Boyle, the previous one, students responding to what they wanted to see. And it was like a spoof. One of the students was in front of like one of the massive building sites at Leicester in a crane. And they were like, yeah, we don't really want any more new buildings. Like, we just like more time with our staff. And then the Vice-Chancellor kind of like seamlessly went to the next slide, which was how much money they were going to spend in the next year on these building projects. So, and again, and I think this is the interesting thing about CMS and Leicester, and it was definitely the case when I was on the branch committee in 2016, the very skills, examining finances, putting forward an imaginary alternative vision, holding people in account to power, all of that was happening in the branch. It was all coming out of the school. And it was successful. It was a manufactured crisis. As I remember in 2016, the major financial crisis was actually the redundancy payments they intended to pay to the people they wanted to get rid of. It's absurd. And I do understand people get scared. It is scary. But for me, and I think this is why it's so great there's so many people on this call, it is far scarier to feel that you are living under, unaccountable power of these often, educated way beyond their intelligence, senior managers who don't care about us, who don't care about our students, who don't care about the institutions they have the privilege of running.
That's great. Thanks, Joe. We're starting to get some questions coming in on the chat. So one of them from Sean O'Brady there, this idea of, kind of schmoozing private donors. Is there any suggestion that at Leicester or indeed elsewhere that that private donors might get scared off by the critical stuff?
That's certainly been an implicit line. Obviously, everything now is conducted in such secrecy by such a small cabal of senior managers. And indeed, it goes beyond the university. Council is incredibly intrusive in decision-making at the university, and many of the academic bodies that would normally act as checks and balances have been eviscerated in various ways, often with their own complicity over the last 5 years or so. So Senate virtually has no powers anymore. It's an executive board instead. The university's court, all the emeritus professors are now a kind of adjunct members rather than proper members, and council holds sway effectively. And we are repeatedly told when we challenge any of the stuff afoot at the moment that this is coming right down from council and is approved by council. And it's council indeed that formally is the guardian of the university's financial well-being, and it is members of the council that chair the key committees like finance and audit committee. But no, I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised to wake up on Monday morning and find out I was working in the Boohoo School of Business. It's as tawdry as that. I mean, the library is funded by an individual and bears the name of an individual who is known to loathe academia.
Yes. Pete, you asked a nice question in the chat, but it might be worth getting you in just because, I can voice you. Could let you voice yourself. Just unmute, Pete. Unmute. That's it.
Martin, I've been throwing quite a few in there.
Yeah. I was just going to pick you up because we're getting questions through the chat, but if people can speak. So Pete, do you want to respond and or sort of respond to your provocation in the chat?
Which one, Martin? I've been putting quite a few in there actually.
You choose. It's moving too fast. You choose.
Well, I mean, there is an interesting issue here about whether you think there's any possibility of proving discrimination on, for union activism. I remember after the national dock strike in 1989, there were a group of unionists in Tilbury, and it took more than 2 years to get their case settled. And when it was found that they were selected on the basis of union membership, the management then said, well, we can't invite them back now because of all the changes, etc. So is that a course that the union is considering, taking up that legal challenge?
So I think, I mean, you've kind of answered the question really. And I think, I don't want to speak on behalf of the branch, but I can see Simon's unmuted. My advice would be, you need to be collecting all of this evidence all the time. But I mean, even before COVID, you're looking at 2 years for a tribunal. Like, the law is not going to save you here. It might end up providing some longer term justice. And obviously, you know, UCU will support Leicester's members, but this is happening now. And that legal solution, if it even ends up a solution, is quite far down the path, really. So I think one of the reasons I wanted to really stress how important and powerful the organising has always been at Leicester is save jobs in the moment, not offered a remedy several months, if not years down the line.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. We're doing what we can in terms of keeping track. On the day it was announced that this was happening, Gareth, myself, and another put in data subject access requests for all communication concerning us from a number of individuals named from the senior management team, the school, the college, the executive board, and indeed council. Needless to say, there's been considerable delay in returning that to us. We're currently led to believe that we might hear something on the 18th of April, I think I'm right, Gareth. But I will not fall over with surprise when I learn of yet another difficulty in producing the information for us at that point.
We've also been highlighting it at any opportunity we're given. So each time someone who is a union officer or rep goes into an individual consultation, they're allowed to bring 2 reps with them. That's part of our agreement at Leicester. And we always do a spiel, you know, we believe there is a union victimisation case here. We will be pursuing it, etc., etc. Which they always respond to by talking about indemnity insurance or whatever. So no individual senior manager ever suffers any consequences if they are later found to have discriminated against their own staff, which you know, is a funny thing to find admitted to in such a clear way.
Indeed, procurement law is quite helpful in that regard. So we do know that it costs £25,000 to insure a bunch of senior managers against personal, or to provide personal indemnity to those individuals. I am kind of left with, though, my car insurance is such that if I go to the end of the road and drive repeatedly at a brick wall, I suspect they're not going to pay out. So I do think there's probably some aspect of conduct that's required for that insurance to actually hold water.
Rachel, could I bring you into the conversation at this point? I mean, I know you're going to talk later on, but as both an industrial relations academic and a dean of school, Rachel is the dean of Cardiff Business School, then, you know, commenting on both the kind of the union aspects of this, but also the sort of university strategy and this idea that I think is reasonably common, that somehow critical research damages the institution.
Thanks, Martin. I mean, to confirm, I'm from the Management Employment Organisation group, but I'm a public management, public services academic, okay. Not necessarily industrial relations. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I'll say a little more about Cardiff later, but it's really not our experience from within our business school. So some of this is harder for me to relate to in that sense. And I'll say later, you know, we've had a strong tradition of critical thinking, critical management within the business school, diversity around research, you know, a clear lack of prescription around our research and teaching, and active sort of voice within the school and our voice beyond the school into the university. And we also operate within a very conducive political environment as well in Wales. So I think that also means that, you know, university management takes different decisions and operates within a hybrid political context sitting between Wales and UK government. So yeah, it's difficult for me to relate to this. It's far removed from my experience.
Yeah, that's in a sense that's very nice to know. We've got a question in the chat here asking, I guess, for Gareth and Simon to talk a little bit about some of the other departments that are subject to redundancy. Got maths, the librarians, I think literature, I think, was also in the firing line. Could you talk a little bit about those other departments and how those staff are responding?
Yeah, so Simon, help me remember the list here. So we've got NPB, which is
neuroscience, psychology and behaviour.
That's right. The library,
maths, informatics, School of English, which isn't actually a school but an area within another school of arts, education services,
something in estates. That might be it.
Yeah, library, education services. Thank you, David. And student services. So some of these are quite weird because what's actually going on is that 2 or 3 professional services areas are being messed about with simultaneously, and jobs might appear in some new areas as yet to be defined. The rationale varies from place to place. So in neuroscience, psychology and behaviour, it seems to be around, it's a game around a certain number of research centres, and also an articulation around bench to treatment and interfacing with clinical sciences. There does seem to be a preponderance of people who are at risk who seem to be on a floor of a building that somebody else a desire to do something else with, but obviously again, correlation is not causation. Yeah, the frontline library staff seem to be being phased out on the grounds that people don't borrow books very much, but I suspect that's probably down a bit due to the pandemic. I think there's also a cynical view that given that's a number of very, very lowly paid staff, many of whom are female, that might be an absolutely wizard trick for dealing with the monstrous gender pay gap that Leicester enjoys. So
it's also worth mentioning
maths and informatics, again, there seems to be various stories. Sorry, maths and informatics, there seems to be a lot of stories around big data and AI. But although again, they seem to be targeting the people that would be most likely but well placed to do that if you were going to do it. And then again, if you were a university in financial trouble, which of course we're not, nobody's saying that, we can't possibly conceive of such a situation when there's this sort of profligate borrowing. But you know, anyone normal, you would think, would invest more in the schools of business and schools of psychology because they are university cash cow. As I mentioned in some of the preamble, I think psychology has been trimmed and has received some degree of retreat from some of the more vicious job losses, largely because when they went forward recently with a master's program for BPS accreditation, lo and behold, that accreditation was not likely to be forthcoming given the appalling staffing levels it looked like they were attempting to work with. So it's, again, it's so hard to get your head around this without an understanding of the finances because it just doesn't make any sense. And then if you do have an understanding of the finances, it doesn't make any sense either because it's going to make things considerably worse.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, it's just because some people on the audience might not know this, that the justification in English for getting rid of a bunch of people who taught mostly kind of medieval stuff and classics was decolonizing the curriculum. So this idea that the Daily Mail got very excited about, that people were being sacked because they wanted to make a more critical department. The contradiction between that and what's happening in the business school, of course, is doesn't need to be commented on, but undoubtedly suggests that they're making it up as they're going along. The other thing I just wanted to push you on, Simon and Gareth, as well, because we're kind of moving towards the end of this section, is does anybody understand what it would mean if an university, which is a charitable corporation, was owned by its creditors or run by its creditors or something like that? I'm not even quite sure what the question means, but it seems kind of important. Joe might have any comments on that as well.
I think it's a real possibility, but no, I think we'd be in absolutely uncharted territories. I don't know what that would entail either. My best guess as what would be likely to happen is that the Office for Students would step in some way and probably force a merger with some other poor unfortunate university in the local environment. Joe may have a better idea.
I was just going to sort of say two things. I mean, I can't answer that question directly because I don't know. I think there are a few issues, and I think this is for me, and we were aware of this last year when we really weren't sure what COVID would mean for universities. We were lobbying the government very hard. We were saying that this sector bad funding is leading to bad decisions. I think the government at the time were relatively relaxed about the idea that you could see mergers. And so I think, you know, you can't really rule out that this government with this type of mandate, with 4 more years under their belt and potentially 9, are coming for us. And I think this is why, this isn't to scare anybody, but to say that these meetings have to be the beginning of continuing to do these meetings. There is a lot down the track for us. Academic freedom, again, you don't need me to point this out, is being used at various times as a culture war to encourage us to step into traps rather than to have that debate on our own terms, to on the one hand attack staff and say you can't research this, and on the other hand to highlight people as being elite and therefore, you know, should be part of a decolonisation agenda. So if you have never really been involved in academic activism or in your university or in your more kind of professional networks, now after this meeting is the time to do it. Start a group, start a collective, stay involved, organise events, because there are going to be further attacks down the road, and a bit like the policing and crime bill that we've just seen, they will pop up out of nowhere with a week's notice, and we will be needing to mobilise people in that moment. And the easiest way to mobilise people at the drop of a hat is to keep people mobilised throughout. So I hope this is the first of many of these events, because I have confidence in Leicester that you are going to push this back like you have several times before, but there will be another Leicester and we will all have to step up for them too.
Can I chip in with one additional point just in terms of the context? Thanks, Joe. I guess it shouldn't go unnoticed that the Chancellor of the University of Leicester is a Lord Willits, who thought when he wasn't a Lord Willits and was just a David Willits that it would be a whizzer scheme to avoid universities being subject to austerity by setting up an enormous fee regime for students with an enormous loan mechanism behind it, and that actually once you've got universities where students aren't coming, where the rest of their economic model, which effectively runs on running hotels on campus, won't work because people can't come and stay in those hotels. And indeed, it also explains why there's been quite so much effort to get everybody back into those into that accommodation in order to keep the income flows up, but with no government intervention, as there has been in other sectors, to try and ameliorate the problems attendant upon the pandemic situation, and government policy, often sensible government policy, at least a little too late, but sensible a little too late, policy precluding people travelling and indeed being in large groups of co-presence.
Thanks, Simon. I remember when David Willits was appointed as our Chancellor when I was still at Leicester, and there was considerable disquiet about that appointment at the time. It seemed to be highly political. So yeah, I hadn't actually made that connection. Be interesting to know what kinds of conversations are taking place between Willits and the present government right now. Gareth, do you want any opportunity to come in for a last anything? And same to you, Joe.
No, just that I still have some Willits out stickers in my archive of propaganda from my Leicester days.
You have an archive of propaganda.
Behind them is in the call.
Why does that not surprise me? Gareth, do you want to say anything?
I was about to say something very similar, actually. In my, I've still got anti-David Willits banners in my office that I haven't been to for months and months and months.
Okay, before this degenerates into an argument about the relative size of sticker collections, oh, stop it, Joe. We'll move over to the second half now. So we've got Bill Harley from the University of Melbourne to kick us off. Thanks ever so much to Bill for pitching up. I think it's now 1 o'clock in the morning where he is. So he's so bless you, sir. Your solidarity knows no bounds. So thanks, Bill. You've got 10 minutes. We're going to move through 4 speakers. I think the order is Bill, Rachel, Pete, and then Mike. So each of you doing 10 punchy minutes, and then back to general discussion. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bill.
Okay, thanks, Martin. And in spite of it being 1 a.m, I'm very happy to be here in solidarity with my colleagues at Leicester. When Pete Turnbull contacted me and invited me to participate, he asked me to say a bit about a paper I published a couple of years ago. So I'll focus on that and refrain from commenting on what's been happening at the University of Melbourne and some of the action I've been involved in there. But of course, if there's time in Q&A and people are interested, I can say something about that then. The paper is something I published in 2019. It was intended to be a mildly provocative and polemical essay about what's wrong with contemporary management studies and I guess business schools more generally, and how these problems were contributing to a crisis of confidence on the part of many scholars. So the sorts of problems that I considered there would be things that I think most or all of you would be very familiar with. So all the sorts of changes that people tend to encapsulate with the term the neoliberal business school. It was not so hard to generate a critique, but what I wanted to do was try to put forward some suggestions about what we as academics might do about the problem. And I avoided anything too ambitious. After all, Martin had already shut down the business school, so I thought that I would think about more micro sorts of things and think about things that I thought perhaps I and people I knew could do. And essentially, my suggestion was that senior business academics should stop behaving in ways that were actually contributing to the problem rather than fixing it. So should stop setting the sort of example which contributes to justifying, perpetuating the neoliberal business, model of the business school. So my starting point was that senior academics, so people who've been in the system for a long time like me, have positions of relative privilege, power and security. Of course, relative, but nonetheless, I think that's important. And so I think there's a responsibility there to stop setting a bad example to other scholars, and particularly junior ones and PhD researchers, and perhaps even to try and set a good example. So the sorts of things that I proposed, which again seemed very modest, were firstly to stop perpetuating the myth that the only model for academic success is a sort of masculine, heroic, competitive individualism in research and publishing. And when I say that, I always think about these keynote speakers at conferences who boast about how they work 80 hours a week, that they have in place finely tuned foolproof strategies to publish what they love to call big hits and so on. The second suggestion I put forward was that senior scholars needed to stop supporting the idea that the only real measure of success is one's standing in terms of journal rankings, impact factors, and citation counts. So things like evaluating people based on which journal they publish in, not what they have to say, and so on. And thirdly, to stop promoting the view that proper research is what we might call science in inverted commas. So functionalist, quantitative, hypothetico-deductive research and not critical work. And my suggestions here, I guess, were motivated by my increasing irritation and at times despair at seeing senior people not just being complicit in the current state of affairs in business school and schools and benefiting from it, but actively promoting it to PhD students and younger colleagues as a good model of how to be an academic. It's a model that says if we're not heroic, individualistic scholars with the massive citation counts, etc., we're not proper. We're not successful academics. And I think for the majority of academics out there who are actually never going to correspond to this kind of mythical model, it's likely that they will feel that what they do is not proper or legitimate, that they're imposters perhaps, because the majority of us can't live up to this kind of mythical model in any case. And I do feel duty bound to say that while the people I was thinking about while I was writing the essay were mostly mainstream non-critical scholars, it would be naive to think that the field of CMS doesn't contain people who are guilty of this, sometimes quite egregiously. I felt like what I proposed was pretty modest, that in fact I might get criticised for being a bit weak in terms of what I was proposing. I got a lot of unsolicited feedback on the paper, and all of it was pretty friendly and supportive. But there was a series of responses I got from senior colleagues, which I found unsettling, to say the least. And I think it could be summarised as something like, "Thanks, Bill. I agree with everything you say about what's wrong, but come on, be realistic. No one's going to do the sorts of things you suggest." And then they tended to put forward a series of arguments. Things like, "Oh, if I didn't promote this kind of stuff, I'd be punished by management or not taken seriously by management." Or, "I was hired to publish in high citation journals. That's what I'm paid to do. So I play the game. That's just how it is." Or, "We're all part of a zero-sum game, and if I don't play this game as well as I can, I'll get paid less than my competitors." And I had people actually using terminology like this. So I think you get the picture. I also did share the essay with my head of department and my dean, both of whom are decent sorts of people. And they both said, "Yeah, I can't disagree with any of this, but none of this is going to change." And then went on their merry way. And I found it fairly disappointing that people in senior positions who actually might be able to do something about this from positions of privilege, power and security would think that the kinds of modest suggestions I made were beyond their capacity. I didn't feel like I was asking for much. Now, my training, my doctoral training was facilitated by lapsed structuralist Marxians. And so reflecting that, I honestly don't think anything much is going to change in terms of the kind of big picture until the current system starts to collapse because of bigger structural changes. And I actually think we're seeing a little bit of that in the pandemic, but how that's going to play out, I'm not sure. But I see lots of colleagues around the world who don't set a bad example. They promote quite different models of what it means to be a good academic. And I see these people actually making a difference to their colleagues and to the shape of management studies, to us as a community. And a number of people here at the workshop are good examples of this. And of course, there are business schools or management schools that have actively resisted this kind of neoliberal model. And I dare say Rachel will be saying more about that in the context of Cardiff shortly. So what I'm proposing here doesn't address immediate problems like the developments at Leicester and other universities, including universities in Australia to some extent, although not to the extent that we're witnessing at Leicester. But I think that at a micro level, encouraging people to set a good example in the sorts of ways that I've suggested probably makes some kind of difference. There may be some value in it. It may make the management studies community and business schools slightly healthier and more pleasant places to be. And I think I'll wind up now, Martin. I must be getting close to time.
You're spot on, Bill. I was just about to come in. And there's an interesting analogy here, isn't there? Just as Gareth, Simon and Joe really are encouraging us to think about collectivism in our labour practices, you're encouraging us to think about more generous, inclusive and collectivist research practices rather than the extremely individualising ones that many of us have been brought up within.
Yeah, I think that's right, Martin. And I would say alongside more traditional collective action of the kind that that's already been discussed, we can't really dispense with that either.
Yeah, they're both aspects of our labour process, right?
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Bill. That was really stimulating. We'll come back to some of those ideas in the questions, I'm sure. Next up, we've got Rachel Ashworth. Rachel is Dean of Cardiff Business School, not so far from where I am now. It's kind of nice to be able to point to somewhere that's a bit of an example for many of us. So, Rachel, without blowing too much smoke up your ass, would you like to do your 10 minutes?
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, and this is where you would say it gets a bit motherhood and apple pie. But thank you very much for the invite. I'm really pleased to be here and to be able to contribute to this event. So I'm going to say a little bit about the Public Value Business School. Some of you will know a bit about the background, others won't. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour in terms of the journey to this point. So I need to go back to my predecessor, Martin Kitchener, and work that he did with Rick Delbridge, thinking, I think, in the aftermath of the financial crisis about the role of business schools. What is the purpose of a business school? The financial crisis cast a shadow over financial services, but also over business schools themselves in terms of our MBA teaching, etc., etc. And so Martin did a lot of work and thinking around this concept of public value, talked a lot with John Brewer from Queen's in Belfast, who wrote about the public value of the social sciences, talked also with Mark Moore from Harvard, who is known for writing around public value in the early days around public organizations, but more recently, more broadly across the economy, challenging every organization to think about what is the public value that you are designed to deliver, because every organization needs to deliver some public value. So we went through endless workshops for a year, so 2015 to 16, where we discussed the concept of value endlessly and talked about publicness. We had Brewer and Mark Moore over, back and forth. We talked with partners, students, staff. Simon, I think you came to a workshop we had on learning and teaching, where we were really interested in the degree program at Leicester and the critical thinking that you were trying to embed from the first year onwards. And this is really what we wanted to try and do within our programs. And Martin emerged from that process with a core kind of, I don't know, you want to call it purpose or mission, but in a nutshell, that is to co-create interdisciplinary education and research that delivers social and economic value. And I think the key aspect of that statement was an explicit commitment to social value, which wasn't traditionally associated with business schools. But I think our concept of economic value is a very specific one too. It is about delivering an economy with others that is fair, that is inclusive, that is financially and environmentally sustainable. So it's a particular kind of economy that we're working to develop. And then our Director of Public Value, as was, Deputy Dean now, Calvin Jones, sat in the coffee shop for about a year with colleagues talking about what they cared about, what they researched, what they taught, and then sort of crowdsourced around 5 key grand challenges, which, you know, won't be surprising to you. There's a decent work, fair and sustainable economies, future organisations, good governance, and responsible innovation. They build on the strengths of the school and what we're really sort of passionate and care about. So Martin started this process, and then I picked that up from him, and the whole school really has taken public value on board. And for us, I think the strategy had to be holistic. So I do see some universities, some schools doing this in relation to research only, or just doing the SDGs through their teaching. But there is no point talking to partner organisations about green supply chains and climate emergency if you're not taking action in your own organisation. And I think in all those grand challenge areas, we had to challenge ourselves, because business schools are big businesses, we're big employers, we spend a lot of money, generate a lot of money. How is that money being invested? How are we supporting local economies and so on? So that holistic nature to public value is very important. The other thing is, going back to some of what Bill said, we were challenged and continue to be challenged. I'm challenged all the time. This is going to kill you in the rankings. This is going to harm your performance as a school. There isn't a trade-off. You know, at Cardiff, people have different strengths. We play to all those strengths, and as a collective, then it is very strong. So some people will like to go off and write lots and lots of research outputs. Others will want to be on the ground doing work with communities. Others will want to invest time in teaching, or whatever it is. It makes sense, and everybody's working towards these broader goals together. We've asked ourselves, and I think in a piece that Rick and Martin wrote in Amley recently, you know, could any school be a public value business school? Was there something about Cardiff? And I think there are maybe some antecedents. right back to the inception of the school under the inaugural Dean Roger Mansfield, there was always a broad conception of research, people working right across a range of disciplines, really at the boundaries of those disciplines, all right in the centre, it didn't matter. And I think that has continued. So the grand challenges have got to be very broad and inclusive so that everyone can take part. And that, like I said, there's no prescription about what we research and teach, and colleagues maybe can testify to some of that. We have that reputation for critical research. You can't do something like this unless you're challenging the status quo. How could it be possible? And so, you know, we need to challenge the world around us and our own world at the same time. We have, I think, the Central University initially, like everybody else, we're a bit kind of what's public value. You know, we've got a lot better, I think, articulating what it is, what it means. Very supportive, and you know, lots of demonstrations of that I can give you. Supportive Welsh government as well. Critical to it though is having colleagues that will challenge you, because you know that is the other dimension that, you know, as a management team, and we need colleagues to say that's not very public value, or that could be better, so that we make sure that we respond to that. So I think in terms of where we are, there's still a lot to do. Public value has resonated, I think, with staff and students and partners. They can talk about it in a lot of detail in their own way. I think it's probably legitimised a lot of activity that was already going on, but we weren't quite sure whether we could do this in a business school. You know, is this the right thing that I should be doing? And of course it is the right thing. And I think the best thing about it is that we're very open now about saying this particular situation is wrong. Adam, we need to do something to address it with others, of course, because we don't have all the answers ourselves. And that, if you take something like decent work, that could be modern slavery in a global supply chain on the other side of the world. It could be actually about fair pay terms and conditions for key workers in the UK, in Wales. It could actually be about communities in Cardiff that are excluded from full economic participation. And there's a horrible life expectancy gap in Cardiff of 20 years between north and south in this tiny city. And as a business school, we should be worried about these things. We've got a heck of a lot to contribute to trying to address them. So I think, you know, that's the Public Value Business School in a bit of a nutshell. I'm pleased to be able to be here. And I think to underline that significant level of challenge and critical thinking and critical management has always been present at Cardiff and will continue to be present in the future, and is essential to delivering a school like a Public Value Business School. Thank you, Martin.
That's terrific, Rachel. Thank you very much. Just to push you on one aspect of that a bit. I think he's on this call, Donica Kavanagh from Ireland, has written a paper recently about the kind of the localization of the business school rather than its globalization. So this idea that business schools, universities in general, but business schools specifically, should really be doubling down on their local responsibilities. That sounds like something that's quite important at Cardiff, rather than chasing the legions of overseas students who are going to pay for new buildings.
Well, I think it's, you know, it's a combination, isn't it? We try to view communities at a range of different levels, and some colleagues will want to work at those communities at different levels. And again, we don't prescribe that. So some of our colleagues, like Jean Jenkins, will want to work in Bangladesh with communities there to address labour rights in garment factories, and that we would be 100% behind. With areas like something like entrepreneurship, I think we recognise there that, you know, entrepreneurship teaching, development, training should not be the preserve of, let's face it, reasonably wealthy students that we recruit to our school, that it actually should also be fully accessible and available to local communities. So we have colleagues who do a lot of that pro bono work across the city, asylum seekers, refugees and others. And so it is really about, I think we're very conscious that the university is still seen as not a place for me by too many people in our city. And the business school is part of that. And so there's a lot of work to do there in making sure that we're properly co-creating, not disseminating and not just doing our stuff and then talking to other people about it, properly co-creating education and research with a range of communities, local and global.
Terrific. Okay, thanks ever so much, Rachel. That's really helpful. Nice link now. So Pete Turnbull, one of my colleagues at Bristol, and it was really this event really was Pete's idea. It was him that suggested it first. It's your fault. But Pete used to work at Cardiff for quite a long time. So Pete, you've got your 10 minutes. He's got 10 slides, 10 minutes. time him, everyone.
I'm going fast.
Okay.
So I'm actually going to pick up on a couple of points that have just been raised in the chat as well, about whether we waste our time doing some of the kind of things that Rachel has just been talking about in terms of working with community groups or trade unions. And also I want to pick up at the end on this idea about what kind of work environment we're creating for young scholars. But I thought what might be interesting for this session is just to appeal to some of the baser instincts of business school deans and university vice chancellors by talking about the cash value of the critical. We're all familiar with the pressure to publish. Bill's just been talking about that. It's interesting that in business and management, the majority of outputs that are submitted to REF are journal articles, and typically those, on various lists that we're aware of. We all kind of know what a 4-star journal article looks like. We're kind of getting pretty used to what that means, and we seem to be getting better at it as well. But I think the other interesting thing is that if you look at impact cases that come from business schools, we're possibly even better at doing that. There's a big, in terms of the proportion of work which is ranked 4 stars, impact cases are really highly ranked in business school, which kind of knocks back a lot of this discussion that's been going on around business schools about rigor and relevance, about how we engage with different groups outside the academy. And there are various calculations around. Of course, I'm going to take the most favourable one, that suggests that a 4-star impact case is worth over £700,000 to a university department, or the university itself, depending on who takes the money, over a 5-year period. So we're pretty good at this in business schools, and it's worth a lot of money, and I'll come back to that. Now, there's an interesting thing about impact cases in terms of the indirect effect and the direct effect. If you actually look at the impact of impact cases on your ranking in the list, and we know that universities and vice chancellors are very keen on saying that, we're the best, or we're in the top 5 or whatever. This analysis, which was undertaken by the Deputy Pro Vice Chancellor for Research at Sussex, tried to work out the impact on your, in terms of your grade point average, and then where you finished in the ranking. So we know that in the next REF, impact is going to be worth 25%. For business and management, it was pretty much worth that last time around in terms of how it impacted where you finished in the rankings. In some of our kind of cognitive disciplines, law, politics, it's getting close to 30%. In sociology, even closer to 40%. And the reason for that, there's a few reasons for this. One is the impact cases were also assessed by people from outside academia as well. And we know that academics mark between 40% and 70%. Other people use the full range from 0 to 100%. And of course, we were less certain last time around about how we would measure things like reach and significance of impact cases. So there was more kind of uncertainty and more variability in the assessment. And also, of course, because you're submitting fewer impact cases for the number of staff in your department, if you get 1 or 2 of these wrong, it has a big effect. If you're submitting 80 members of staff, each with 4 publications, and a couple of those for a couple of people at only 2 stars, they get kind of swallowed up in the whole, in the bigger picture of all these research outputs. With impact cases, it has a bigger effect because they're just smaller numbers. Now, when you look at the feedback from REF on the impact on the research that's being done in business schools, it clearly does reflect very well on the business community, the point we just made. And one of the interesting things is that organisation studies, the kind of people we're talking about who, the critical management studies in kind of org studies areas, a lot of that work provides the kind of underpinning support for lots of impact cases. So your impact case might be on a particular topic, but a lot of the kind of underlying theory and ideas have actually come through organisational research. We've got a pleasing number for employment and human resource management. Operations, innovation, technology features heavily. International business contributes a significant number. strategic management, relatively few, information systems, surprisingly relatively few, and marketing, a scarcity of impact cases. So some of these kind of traditional business areas, you know, the things that are being promoted in a lot of schools are not kind of contributing to this very important area of impact that we're now expected to produce. This is a more detailed study of some of these impact cases and where they're being done. And again, you see significant numbers from human resource management, organizational studies. People are doing stuff in the area of work and organizations. Last year, myself and a colleague, Hugh Thomas, we went through all the impact cases from all the management schools, business and management schools in the UK, trying to identify those who were submitted by people who we would think would not be unhappy about being labelled, if you like, or categorised as a critical labour or a critical management studies scholar. And we identified around 30 cases where we were pretty confident that the people who submitted these cases would not be unhappy about being, say, you know, about being in that kind of group who we're talking about at Leicester as kind of critical scholars. If you do the math, that works out at about £21 million that's coming into business schools from critical scholars doing impact beyond the academy. What we also did during the lockdown last year, myself and a colleague, we decided to interview 47 critical scholars in business schools to talk to them about working in a business school, about the kind of support that they get from their school, about the kind of pressures that they face from the ref, trying to balance all these particular demands. And we in particular tried to identify people who we knew had submitted a high rated impact case based on the feedback that came from schools. So we had 47 colleagues in total, and we had 17 who'd submitted impact cases. And I just thought I'd share some of the quotes from the people who submitted these high rated impact cases about their experience of doing this kind of work in the business school. So we had quite a few comments from people about the fact that business school deans were not, you know, were focusing more on 3- and 4-star publications and not the kind of work that we often do with the labour movement, with community groups and various others beyond the academy. A lot of the focus was on these 3- and 4-star publications, about the fact that people didn't get much credit for it. And the kind of quote at the bottom here, that this idea that we're needed but not valued, I think was quite a kind of common theme that came out, that when people actually look at what we do as critical scholars in business schools, they can usually be persuaded that we are doing a decent job in terms of publications, but also making this really significant contribution to impact. And yet, even when people are doing that, as you see from this particular quote, the business school is reluctant to put it on the slide that says research achievements. So people are doing this work, but it's not, even then, it's not the kind of stuff that is being flagged up in university publicity. And there is this kind of narrative that people often get, that the work that they do is not relevant, and yet a lot of these impact cases are coming from these particular areas. And it seemed that at best, I think the quote at the bottom encapsulates what a lot of people feel, is that at best you kind of get left alone if you're publishing and doing impact, but there's not the kind of active support that that people would look for. So I think we're in this situation. A couple of people have already raised in the chat about the similarities or differences between what's happening at Leicester now and what happened at Keele a few years ago with the closure of the Department of Industrial Relations there. There is this perception amongst kind of senior colleagues, the kind of people that Bill was talking about, that we're a bit like the frog in the water that's being gradually boiled up, and we're just taking on more and more of these responsibilities. And as Bill said, as senior academics, we might be able to cope with this. But the danger is that we're creating an environment where when you put younger researchers, early career people into this boiling water, they're going to want to jump out like the frog. And I think that's a real danger, and again, something that we really have to think about, because, while people like myself have been around and others like Martin have been around a long time, are we actually creating an environment where the next generation of critical scholars can come through and work in business schools. And I think this is all part of a kind of a longer term trend, and raises all the kind of questions that we're asking about the role of critical scholarship in the business school. Was that 10 minutes, Martin? Am I?
That was 12 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. I'll take it off the rest of your life. Okay, do you want to unshare? Just worth, as just while Pete's doing that, I was responsible for the last ref at Leicester, and I was just checking my notes, but at least 2 of the case studies that we submitted were critical, inverted commas, and there were others which, you know, could easily be articulated as informed by organisation studies or industrial relations. That in itself, I thought, was quite an interesting reflection on what Pete was saying. It'd be interesting to see what the case studies submitted in the ref for Leicester this time were. Pete, can you unshare? So
I am doing my best here, Martin.
I just kept on filling space and hoping that, you know, you'd be unsharing at some point.
What's happening now?
I have no idea. It seems to be stuck. I think if you go on the share screen button, doesn't it allow you to? Oh no, hang on. Oh, what's gone on there? Something exciting. If you go on the options at the top, does it say? Is there a red button? I think it is, that says stop sharing, something like that. If I remember that rightly on Zoom.
As you are screen share, can I do that?
Yeah. So you are at the moment. I thought because I think Mike Renato is also hoping to. There we go. Thank you, Pete. Feel sorry for your students. Okay. Right, that was grand. Thank you very much indeed. Cash value of critical through impact studies and a bit of flanneling. So last speaker before we move to questions, where Mike Marinetto, who has just fantastic. Well done, Mike. Just done straight there. So Mike, and we're moving back to Cardiff again now. Thank you very much.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Great,
yeah.
Great stuff. Okay. Thanks to Pete and Martin for organising this workshop. Thank you. And thank you especially to the audience out there for taking the time to turn up today and listen and participate. It wouldn't be much without you all, so thank you. Now, the situation at Leicester really is a case of gallows humour, but without the humour. I've been asked to speak about what are academics for, and I've been pondering this question for several years, and a lot of what I've got to say has some overlap with what Bill said earlier on, which I really appreciated. And in fact, this whole question is really central to my research. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mike Marinetto. I am a recovering academic of sorts. Now, it took one simple step to regain sobriety when some years back I read a book by Russell Jacoby, The Last Intellectuals. Jacoby's an American historian, and in his 1987 book is a sort of paean to the fading of the public intellectual within society, but also within universities. And reading The Last Intellectuals changed not only my scholarly focus, but also I began a sort of stuttering reappraisal about what I thought is the real role of the academic. And after pondering Jacoby for some time, I felt I reached a definitive answer, at least I thought I had. And a definitive answer to this vexed question, what are academics for? And crucial to the answer I felt was the relationship between the academy and academics and research. And influenced by Jacoby, I came to the conclusion that academics as researchers need to go beyond the peer group, if you like, beyond specializations and publishing papers to engage with a broader audience, broader public. And I sort of still believe that. And if there was one axiom that really captured what I stood for on the matter of what academics are, it came from that famous statement from Marx's Theses on Feuerbach, written in 1845. Philosophers have here interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Now, I felt, if anything, encapsulate the true purpose of the academic is this statement. But in recent times, I've sort of felt that maybe Marx only has it half right, because as I've sort of grown older and maybe possibly a little bit wiser, I've started to somewhat rethink many of the critical ideas I had about academia and about the role of the academic. And if anything captured my new thinking, it was sort of a reimagining of Marx on Feuerbach. And I felt ultimately it's hard enough for philosophers to interpret the world in various ways, let alone change it. Why? I think it's worth recalling what Marx said in 1852 in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. We make our own history, but we don't necessarily make it under our own choosing. Now, the main contradiction we face as academics is a historical contradiction to do with the political economy that drives academic research. I think we as academics are locked into, and I saw Bill was sort of referring to this, into an academic prestige economy. And this economy is controlled by the big five academic publishing houses, Reed, Elsevier, Springer, Wiley, Blackwell, and so on. If you like, the university publishing complex. Now, the big publishers have quite cleverly learned how to make themselves indispensable to the prestige economy, owning and controlling many of the high impact journals. Research has shown that over 70% of articles in the social sciences are controlled by the big five. Now, there's clearly an economic logic as well as intellectual and scientific logic behind the endless growth of academic publishing. Publishers need this as part of their price gouging business model, and we need it to progress professionally. Now, Marx was really a prophet of overproduction, and in the Communist Manifesto of 1848, he and Engels commented that capitalism has got itself into an unlikely fix. It's in the midst, they wrote, of an epidemic. We know how that feels. In all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Nearly 2 centuries on, the affliction has spread from the factory floor to the ivory tower. Now, contrary to what the powers that be at Leicester think, political economy is central to understanding the academic life. And so strangely, I'll try and finish off with this, strangely being conscious of that political economy of the academy has led me to sort of think that really it's necessary to do what the philosopher Edmund Husserl called epoche, or bracketing off. And I think for me, it's necessary to bracket off the academic publishing from good old fashioned boring scholarship, you know, being locked up in a library and doing that sort of reading texts. And so contrary to what Marx on Feuerbach might think, I'm convinced that the a priori of academic life before we engage publicly in publicly facing activities, before we do public intellectual work or offering ourselves as policy experts, is to do real scholarship. That may seem pretty obvious, but what's less obvious is what we mean by scholarship, or what I regard by scholarship. And I wouldn't necessarily equate great scholarship with being published in top-ranking journals, although no doubt there are some great examples of scholarship in these journals, such as this particular article. Sorry, we should go to reviewing by emoji. That's the future, I think, for any editors out there. My instinct is that scholarship is about synthesizing ideas that don't necessarily belong with each other it is deeply counterintuitive activity rather than being technically proficient. Scholarship is experimental and not wholly driven by instrumental professional demands. Scholarship is about digging deep into a field without hyper specialization. It's not necessarily bounded by disciplinary concerns. Scholarship need not be published. It may come in the form of an archive or a series of lectures. And ultimately, I think that this scholarship should drive our engagement with the world, and central to scholarship is academic freedom. And really, as well as people's livelihoods, this is what is at stake in terms of what's going on at Leicester. So I'd like to finish on an optimistic note and sort of reevaluate or reimagine Marx on Feuerbach once more. I think, if anything, epitomizes where I am in terms of the role of the academic today and what the academic's for. I think it's summed up in this quote: at this bastardization of Marx, philosophers have hitherto interpreted the world in various ways. That's their job. The point is to do it well, and then maybe you can change the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. That's grand. I've been quite interested in that sort of idea, particularly in the sort of the context of, what you might gloss as the neoliberalization of the university. This sort of question about what's distinctive about universities then, what do they do that's any different from a whole bunch of other institutions that produce various kinds of knowledge products? And, I think you captured that quite nicely. If you can unshare, Mike, that would be grand. And then we can go to some questions from the audience. That's lovely. Thank you very much indeed. I had, as some of you may have seen in the chat, not realised that there was a separate questions function after having taken the piss out of Pete Turnbull for not understanding Zoom. So I'm going to go to some of the questions that we've got up here. First of all, we've got somebody who's very familiar to quite a few of us here, Peter Armstrong, who asks, shouldn't we be talking about the democratization of universities more generally, including things like electing VCs, for example? Would anyone like to have a go at that one?
Yes, we should.
Thank you very much. Any amplification on that as a political strategy? Some of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, possibilities, maybe?
I think, sorry to bang the same drum I had earlier, but demands and ideas are great, and I don't think many people would say, yeah, we shouldn't not elect VCs. But how do we grab hold of the infrastructure that allows us to do that? Because we can have loads of really good, strong ideas about what governance looks like, but if we don't have industrial leverage to actually insert ourselves into those processes in our organisations, all we have is a really good set of ideas. And I think that's what makes what's happened at Leicester so powerful, because I think as a branch, actually, Leicester have been able to do that. They toppled a vice-chancellor, which is very hard these days. So reaching out to students, I think students have disproportionate kind of power and influence in these debates, and being willing to kind of roll your sleeves up. And I think there's a role for UCU nationally, but I think, yes, obviously, but how are we going to do it?
Yeah, so you've got to get power before you can make these kinds of demands, I suppose, would be your response, essentially, isn't it?
Well, you can make them, but
have leverage.
I could go into the supermarket and say, give me my food for free, but what are you going to do?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, and spin on to the next question from Leo McCann, ex-Manchester, which is a place with a similarly checkered history, I think. He's kind of pointing to some of the difficulties of Pete's argument in the context of really, incredibly profitable fee structures for universities. Why do they need to care about impact cases that much, or even the ref that much, Pete, when they're making so much cash off student fees?
I think it's what Mike was talking about before, the prestige economy, isn't it? I mean, there is this clear association that you get students by, being high in the rankings and various other things. I mean, I think it'd be interesting just to ask Rachel whether she thinks that you know, the kind of message of a public value system school has an impact on, you know, the kind of students you're actually able to recruit, and whether there's actually a space for that kind of diversity in the market, or whether we all need to be vanilla, as you were suggesting.
Do you want to come in,
I mean,
Rachel?
I think we're caught in between a system where we have got high fee paying students at high volume in business schools, and then we've got science schools pulling in funded research. So one of our big debates, you know, as business school deans with our senior teams is this talk of unfunded research, which is actually funded by international students. So, you know, and that gets back to Joe's point about the funding structures of the system. I think within that, you know, a strategy like public value is really helpful. It really demonstrates to university very clearly the contribution of the school in all sorts of ways, and it allows us. We've developed quite a big campaign around recruitment of students, talking with our students about what issues they're worried about, they care about, and they lead that campaign. And we have seen that lead to some diversity in the markets. It's early days, but it's, you know, public value in that sense is a really helpful vehicle in terms of communicating a different story about a business school, other than being, you know, the cash revenue generating department of the university.
And having that kind of narrative within the university as a way of talking back to senior management becomes really important, doesn't it? Because it's difficult for them to disagree with public value, right? It's, you know, motherhood and apple pie.
You had good conversations with council, university council, about value creation and different forms of value creation, and I think that's where we need to get to in terms of changing perceptions of the business school. Yeah. Nonetheless, despite what you know, Rachel's school may be an example of a countervailing tendency, but I think there's a wide perception amongst lots of the people on this call that times are getting hard for critical people. And this question from Richard Owen, one of my colleagues at Bristol, is really asking about the kind of early career research prospects. And maybe Gareth, you'd like to come in on this, because you kind of self-identified as an ECR, didn't you?
Yeah.
Do you wish you'd been a bit more vanilla?
Well, I mean, this employment of ECRs in kind of critical areas in business schools. But I mean, there's something interesting. Not only me, but two of the other people currently being threatened with redundancy were only employed in our business school within the last 2 to 4 years, and on the strength of our critical work. So that there's a kind of, albeit under a different dean, but there is a kind of disconnection between those two processes. And I wonder if part of that is, for all its many, many faults, within many business schools and other academic departments, recruitment processes still maintain an element of democracy in them. There is some extent to which kind of colleagues or the department as a whole can kind of get on board with that and kind of meaningfully sort of express opinions about it. Whereas the redundancy processes, obviously, you know, they don't even necessarily come from the head of the school. They could come from college or from higher up still. And I think, you know, the other thing probably to add to that is the marketing of courses or marketing of modules, I think, is another very big way in which business schools are shaped and reshaped. And certainly in Leicester, what we saw was our own modules being remarketed in a way that was completely out of our hands, in a way to make them seem more and more and more orthodox. So even though the content didn't necessarily change, students had a different set of expectations about what they were coming to. You know, and I long argued, and now I feel like I've been proven right, that this was a prelude to getting rid of the critical scholar.
So just to kind of give me an example of that, Gareth. So this is a way in which, say, a course which is a priori intended to be critical of whatever is then presented as if it's a fairly anodyne, I don't know, business ethics course or something.
Yeah, with the kind of critical elements of it downplayed or you know, removed from the sort of advertising, etc. You know, so that the expectations are different.
And the logic here is presumably for those people engaged in this marketing that they don't want to scare the horses. They'll present things that are fairly bland and generic. Yeah. Okay. We've got another comment and a couple of more comments about ECRs in the chat as well. You know, if anybody else wants to come into this, the kind of expectations that ECRs have now you're expected to have, you know, 4-star, 3-star publications, grants, etc., all this kind of stuff. My perception of this, you know, is I've been doing this for quite a long time, but when I started in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a kind of an expectation you'd just be left alone for a bit to learn how to do the job, and teaching and exam boards and all those kinds of things. Now that doesn't really seem to be the case. You seem to be expected to be, you know, firing on all cylinders as soon as you arrive, and that's a pretty difficult thing for many entrants to the profession. Do any of you want to pick up on that specifically?
Yeah, I think that's a key issue, but I also think in terms of the boiling of frogs thing, that's partly the problem with governance, is that actually there was considerably more democratic governance, and in many cases we've let that slip without realizing it was being taken away. And I think in relation to that, there has been definitely a step change. I think when I came in, I remember my first interview somewhere, somebody called me up on the fact that I was doing qualitative stuff, and that seemed to be fine eventually. And then they addressed something else. Would you teach managers Marx? And I said, yes. Isn't Marx just Adam Smith played backwards? And that seemed to, again, be fine. I got the job. Now, I subsequently found out that I got the job not because anybody was paying any attention to what I said. It's just I had a few shiny bits of paper that would be submittable. And in that sense, again, going back to what Pete was saying, critique wasn't a problem if you could sell it. We're now at the position where critique's a problem even if you can sell it profitably. That's a very different thing, and that's a very different ideological ratchet that's being applied to particularly early career researchers coming in. I've sat on interview panels recently where I've been told explicitly that the last thing we need is another Foucauldian, for example.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting distinction. And in a sense, the growth of critical management studies has been based on precisely that idea that it didn't matter what you say as long as it sold, as long as it was published in a halfway decent journal. Bill, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my observation, increasingly as the, you know, this kind of ideal type of the neoliberal business scholar is pushed more and more, that what's defined as good is uncritical by definition, because the critical work is not being done by the kind of people who are publishing quantitative, narrow hypothesis testing papers in a narrow range of journals and so on. So I've sat on a lot of panels, and very often the criticism of somebody will be, well, their publications just aren't as good as these other publications, which is really effectively code for they're doing the wrong kind of research. And so, you know, I know there are the same issues in the UK that we have here with students getting PhDs by publication. And many of my colleagues would say our job is to help PhD students learn how to publish in A-star journals. That's what they've got to do by doing a PhD. It's not anything else. And so I think there's quite a pernicious effect from the kinds of bad examples I'm talking about.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill. Can I just, there's a nice one down here from Daniel Fisher, who's a PhD student at the business school formerly known as CAS, about the idea of a coalition of sort of public value business school stuff. Just let me pitch that to Rachel. So the idea that, you know, if collectivism is important in this regard, then maybe some of the progressive business schools should be getting together and setting a bit of an example.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. A lot of the challenge actually to us often comes from, you know, it comes from within our own system. It's our own system that's doing this to ourselves, you know, our institutionalization of the cabs list. And, you know, that's something that the business and management community has done to itself. And so we're a signatory now to DORA, other schools increasingly are. That's a real way of getting to grips with that and talking differently about research and not viewing research on the basis of where it's published, but in its own right as a piece of work as it stands. And I think, you know, getting schools together that take DORA seriously and that have a different approach is a good idea. We've got some connections internationally with schools like that. So I think that's something we definitely could do nationally. Martin Kitchener is doing some work for CABS at the moment on business schools for the public good, trying to just do some analysis of where we are in the UK, and then trying to not necessarily classify schools, but see where we could make connections. So I'm sure he could relay some of the findings there in terms of, you know, I think his report is about to come out, so that could be useful.
Yeah. We're starting to run out of time, and I'm kind of keen to go around the room one more time. There's lots more questions. There've been loads of stuff in the chat. I'm hoping that we'll put this conversation online. I think I can save the chat somehow as well, can't I? I think it gets emailed to me, but I'll find out about that, because there's loads of good stuff in there. And we're not going to have time to answer all the questions that are in the question Q&A box either. So in the remaining 4 minutes that we have, can we just go around the room again and just get people to reflect on what they've heard so far? Let's do it in the order that people spoke. So start off with Simon, if I can.
Well, it's great to hear that there are still examples of places trying this or trying versions of this successfully, and more power to your elbow, Rachel. I hope it continues to succeed. As Rick said in the chat, it is somewhat ironic that I was kind of invited down to speak about, you know, that here's a successful model which keeps the money flowing and keeps people happy. And that was, you know, maybe one of the bits of reassurance that enabled progressing the model, only to find that that's not the case where I am. But again, I mean, a lot of this stuff is structural, but there are certainly some key individuals in play in our own institution that are pushing the agenda in the direction it's going. So I think in terms of working out where one resists, there are collective and structural issues that one needs to consider, and sectoral issues, but one also needs to know in some detail who the enemy is precisely and target one's action there.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's both kind of testament to how rapidly things can change, Simon, but also, you know, the importance of whose side you're on, I think, isn't it? Gareth, do you want to sort of pull out some takeaways?
Yeah,
I believe some people
the opposite side of the same coin, I suppose. It has been great to hear that there are, you know, some people still sort of holding on to that kind of critical community within particular business schools. It's also been interesting to see, particularly reading through the chat, how many people in different institutions feel under threat as critical scholars. That's been very interesting, and I think it really highlights the need to maintain this dialogue and keep doing some organising together around this. So thanks very much, Martin, Pete, and everybody else for kind of getting the ball rolling here.
Thanks, Gareth. I mean, the thanks should go to Katie Hadfield and Lauren Hall, who really actually organised the Eventbrite and everything else. I've just been the pretty face. So yeah, thanks, Joe. No jokes needed. So Joe, do you want to do some say something inspirational?
I will say something inspirational by pinching somebody else's words. So some of you may be aware that many months ago now, maybe even getting on for a year, Arundhati Roy said that the pandemic is a portal. And now I am not normally one for sound bites or being overly optimistic. However, what I do think is we have seen during this pandemic that people who are tired, people who are burnt out, people who are exploited, whether that's student, staff, or any other kind of cross-section of society, have not just let things happen to them, that you have agency. You know, as particularly academics with particular cultural capital, with resources, with professional networks, we have incredible power at our disposal to not only articulate things, to have people in the media listen to us, but also to be people who are listened to in our communities. Students throughout this pandemic, despite the fact that they were, you know, drawn back to campus, lured back to campus with disastrous consequences, have been reaching out to organise with staff. And we've seen this at Leicester, we've seen it at Manchester with students doing their own referendums, no confidence in vice chancellors. So there's a comment in the chat about how do we continue. There is obviously a role for the National Union to be organising, and we're working with the NUS on a national basis. I'm coming to meetings and trying to help. But locally, doing these things, starting your own groups, is how we will build a kind of a coalition. Because as I said earlier, we have at least 4 years of this government, potentially 9. You know, the terrain is hostile for us. So actually really bringing together people, if we want to see a different future, if we want to see the pandemic as a portal, we've got to roll our sleeves up and build it. And I think I don't want anyone to leave this meeting sort of pessimistic, because Leicester are doing it and have done it. And I have faith that this will end in a way that, you know, people at Leicester deserve, because the fight is there. But we all have a role to play after we've left this meeting, to think about who are our networks, who can we reach out to, you know, and think beyond ourselves and organising our communities. So that's kind of how I'll leave it.
That's brilliant, Joe. I mean, so many people on the kind of the green left have been talking about, you know, building back better and all the rest of it. So echoing Arundhati Roy's portal metaphor, then yeah, maybe we should be thinking about that in terms of universities too. Next up, just you know, 30-second sound bites, because we're already over and I can see we're starting to lose people. Bill, it's now 2 o'clock in the morning.
It's my computer tells me it's 2:01. I'm pretty tired now, but well, I just wanted to say that it was a privilege to be here. My colleagues at Leicester, the best. And I guess I would also just want to endorse what Joe is saying about the opportunities that the current situation presents, and the importance of organising to take advantage of those opportunities, alongside I suppose, the kind of academic, you know, traditionally academic interventions people.
Agitate, educate, organise. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah,
Rachel.
also, you know, privileged to be here, and as we said, you know, we've learned a huge amount from Leicester in developing public value strategy. I think there are many more schools actually like Cardiff. We just found a way of articulating this and you know, and being explicit about it. But I know that there are other schools that are similar. There were some of the points there about to reassure ECRs. We are recruiting critical management studies lecturers at Cardiff and many other institutions, and you know, their work is most exciting and invigorating that we see, so keep that coming. And students care more about these issues almost than we do, so that the idea that they'd be nervous or frightened by critique is you know, far from our experience. And I think Hugh Wilmot made the point in the chat, you know, there are non-CMS colleagues that are really concerned about development. So I think, you know, it is about pulling together the community here to say that, you know, whatever discipline within business management we are in, that there is room and space for diversity and critical thinking together.
Yeah. Really shouldn't be hard to argue for pluralism within a university, should it? You know. Okay, well, Pete.
Yeah, I'd just like to, for me, just to pull together some of the connections here. I mean, Mike talked about what it means to be a scholar, and that starts with our PhD students, and doing the very opposite of what Bill was talking about before, where some of his senior colleagues see this as helping people publish in these journals. That's not what it means to be a scholar. And I think from that we can say that we have to give people the confidence that by being a critical scholar, you can do good work, you can have an impact beyond the academy as well as, you know, through publications. But for that confidence, we need the time and the security, because, you know, these things take a long time to develop, to build up networks. And we'll only get that with the kind of organisation that Joe talked about, and the kind of spaces that are being created at places like Cardiff and hopefully at Bristol. So hopefully, you know, we'll have jobs and we'll be able to do some of this ourselves to make a space where people can do this work and feel confident about it.
Absolutely, echoed Pete. And just to finish with Mike. Muted. Someone had to do it.
Sorry. I'm lucky that I do work in an institution that respects academic freedom. I thought I should mention that because my dean is here. But I do believe that. But that's not the case at Leicester, and it seems at Leicester they buck the iron law of publish or perish. That, you know, you publish and you still perish. So I look forward to a future where you can publish and hopefully flourish. And I'll finish with that sound.
That's grand. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you.
Could I just, it's 4:05 now, we'd better bring this to a close. I suspect this conversation could go on for a very, very long time indeed, and indeed it should. And yeah, I'll commit to organising some more stuff on this. Thank you ever so much to our three speakers, to our speakers. So to Gareth and Simon, you know, yeah, I mean, solidarity and everything. Joe, thanks ever so much for making time and turning up. Bill, Rachel, Mike and Pete, particularly Pete, because you suggested it in the first place. And thanks to Katie and Lauren for